Welcome back to Let's Talk About It. I'm Lonnie. Today we're stepping into a case that's nearly a century old and somehow still feels raw. Christine and Léa Papin, two sisters who worked as live-in maids. One respectable home in France, and a night of violence so extreme that even now, people argue over what it meant, what caused it, and whether we'll ever be able to make it make sense. This is one of those stories where the timeline is pretty solid. We know what happened, we know when it happened, and we know who did it. But the why is like smoke. Every time you think you've got it, it slips through your fingers. So let's talk about what we do know and why the unanswered parts still disturb people today. Christine Papin was 27. Her younger sister Léa was 21. They've been working for the Lancelin family since 1927, so for about 6 years by the time everything went wrong. The Lancelins live in a 3-story home on Rue Bruyère in Le Mans. René Lancelin was a retired lawyer. His wife was Lonnie, and their adult daughter, Genevieve, also lived at home. The sisters' world was the house. They slept in a small attic room. They weren't known for socializing. They rarely went out except for church. And their workdays were long, repetitive, and closely supervised. Madame Lancelin had a reputation for being exacting, the kind of employer who notices everything and lets you know when you've done something wrong. People later described the home as strict and formal, not warm and chatty. You can imagine how that might feel day after day, with 2 young women living under someone else's roof, someone else's rules, someone else's scrutiny. And yet, here's the strange part. There wasn't a documented trail of drama. No official complaints. No police visits. No public blow-ups that the neighbors could point to afterward and say, "Oh yes, we saw this coming." Just this sense, in hindsight, that pressure had been building quietly behind closed doors. Now we get to February 2nd, 1933. It's early evening. A household problem happens, the kind of boring, everyday thing that usually becomes a brief irritation and then a forgotten footnote. An iron malfunctions and causes an electrical short. Part of the home's power goes out. When Madame Lancelin and her daughter Genevieve return later that day, they notice the issue and confront the sisters about it. And this is where the story breaks open. Because whatever was said, whatever was felt in those minutes, it didn't stay contained. It didn't turn into an argument that blew over. It turned into murder. René Lancelin arrives home around 6:30 p.m. The house is dark. The door is locked. He can't get in. That alone is unsettling because the home is supposed to be running like a machine. So he calls the police. When officers force entry, what they find is not a chaotic struggle spread across the house. It's concentrated. On the second-floor landing, Lonnie and Genevieve are lying there. They've been beaten badly. Investigators identify a pewter pitcher and a hammer as weapons. And then there's the detail that has become inseparable from this case. Both women's eyes have been gouged out. There are deep wounds across their faces and legs. Some injuries appear to have been inflicted after they were already dead. A kitchen knife is found nearby, linked to the mutilation. If you're listening and thinking, who does that and why, you're having the same reaction people had in 1933. Because this isn't only homicide. It's overkill. It's intimate violence, the kind that suggests something has snapped so completely that normal human boundaries have disappeared. Then the police go upstairs to the attic room. Christine and Léa are there. They're naked. They've washed off the blood. Their clothes, stained, are folded neatly beside the bed. And what's perhaps even more unnerving than anything else is how they behave. They don't run. They don't fight. They don't put on a performance of shock. They're calm. When questioned, Christine admits it. Not with a long explanation, not with excuses, but with a brief, blunt confirmation. Yes. From there, the case becomes a tangle of statements that never quite line up. Christine initially says she did it alone. Léa points to Christine as the one who began the attack, saying she only got involved once the violence was already underway. Their stories shift. The details wobble. And neither sister ever gives a clear, satisfying reason for the mutilation. Forensic investigators can't definitively say who inflicted which wounds. The public, of course, fills in the gaps. The newspapers fixate on the sisters' composure. Some interpret it as insanity. Others see it as cold defiance. When people can't find an explanation that fits, they argue about which explanation is least impossible. The trial begins on September 29th, 1933, and it moves fast. Just 2 days. 2 days to look at a brutality that still feels hard to describe, and then decide, what were they exactly? Monsters? Victims? Out of their minds? Fully aware? Something in between? The prosecution frames the killings as deliberate and cruel, leaning into the idea of premeditation and sadism. The defense pushes a different picture, not a long, careful plan, but a sudden eruption after years of strain. The argument is that psychological pressure, control, isolation, and constant scrutiny created a kind of emotional compression until one spark hit and everything exploded. Experts disagree about Christine's mental condition. Some believe in the idea of a shared psychotic disorder between the sisters, the concept often referred to as folie-à-deux, where two people, deeply bonded and isolated, end up sharing a distorted reality. Others argue Christine knew exactly what she was doing and could distinguish right from wrong. And outside the courtroom, the story becomes even bigger than the sisters themselves. Conservative papers present the case as proof of moral decay among domestic workers, as if the sisters are a warning sign. Meanwhile, leftist thinkers later reinterpret the crime as something closer to class violence, a brutal uprising from people trapped at the bottom of a rigid social structure. Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre become part of that later conversation, helping turn the Papin case into a kind of cultural symbol rather than only a criminal file. When the jury deliberates, it doesn't take long. Less than 2 hours. Christine is sentenced to death by guillotine. That sentence is later commuted to life in prison. Léa receives 10 years of hard labor. And then comes the aftermath, which is its own quiet tragedy. Christine does not stabilize in prison. Her mental health deteriorates. She refuses to eat. She reports hallucinations. She repeatedly begs to see Léa. She attempts suicide more than once. And in 1937, only 4 years into her sentence, she dies from self-starvation. Léa serves 8 years and is released in 1941. After that, she disappears into an assumed name and lives the rest of her life away from the public gaze. She dies in 1982, and as far as anyone knows, she never publicly explains what happened that night. No interview tour, no late-life confession, just silence. So we're left with one of the most frustrating parts of this case: motive. The sisters never provide a clean narrative that connects the confrontation about the electricity to the level of violence that followed. Christine at one point suggests something chilling, saying the women wouldn't die, implying she kept attacking past the point where death had already occurred. But even that doesn't explain why the eyes were gouged, why the body was mutilated, why the rage took that specific form. Léa, for her part, claims she doesn't remember. And this is why the Papin sisters never stop being discussed, because the case refuses to sit still. It keeps changing shape depending on who's looking at it and what they're trying to understand about the world. Artists and writers turn it into metaphor. Jean Genet transforms it into the play The Maids, which takes the dynamic of employer and servant and turns it into something theatrical and psychologically sharp. Filmmakers revisit it too, including Claude Chabrol with La Cérémonie, using the story's bones to explore class, resentment, and violence. Psychologists return to it as a possible example of shared delusion, codependency, and isolation curdling into something dangerous. Feminist interpretations ask what it means that two working women, living under control and judgment, turn their violence toward the mistress of the house and her daughter. Criminologists focus on the practical questions: the timeline, the weapons, the injuries, the escalation. And the general public, then and now, keeps circling the same dark center. How does a domestic dispute turn into something this extreme? So what do we do with a story like this? Do we file it under madness and move on, telling ourselves it's rare, it's abnormal, it's someone else's nightmare? Or do we look at it as a warning about pressure and isolation, about what can happen when people live with no outlet, no voice, no escape? And here's the hard part. None of these explanations fully satisfy. Maybe that's the real reason the Papin sisters still haunt the culture. Because they force us to face a truth we don't like. Sometimes people break in ways that don't come with a neat label. Sometimes the human mind collapses without leaving a clear note explaining how it happened. Two sisters, a rigid household, a confrontation over a power outage, and then a level of violence that still feels unreal. Was it psychosis? Rage? Trauma? A shared unraveling that fed on itself? We can argue it forever, but we probably won't ever know what it felt like inside that house in those final minutes before everything changed. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk About It. Until next time, be safe, and if this episode stuck with you, share it with someone who likes to dig into the stories that don't come with easy answers.